My name is Roy Austin, with the Dunn County Historical Society. I'm the president this year, and maybe last year, and maybe next year. Depends on how they railroad me. This is a great turnout. I'm really happy to see this. Yesterday we had the grand opening of our new exhibit area, which this ferry you see in front of you was on exhibit, and we'll go back there after today's session. But Jim built this in the last about 2 weeks, the last month, and he put this together in about a 2 or 3 week period of time. He really worked pretty hard on it. Or except the L family was the last operating family of the Caryville Ferry in Dunn County, and we also have in the audience, now I forgot her name. You got to read it too. Oh yes, Helma Osterud Gillette, or Golette. And her family helped run the Meridian the ferry, so...
No.
Oh,
We just...
Caryville Ferry, who is the Meridian?
Let me do these.
Hey, you do these. Okay, here we are. Here's Jim L.
Thank you. Okay, we'll make some introductions. I'm Jim, and my older brother Fred is over here, and the younger brother Art. Our other brother Rod is on a special assignment to a resort in the Rocky Mountains, doing tough duty. Mrs. Goulet, or Goulette, was Hilma Osterud when her father ran the Caryville Ferry. So that's a dignitary. Did Evelyn Cartwright come today? Now your Evelyn Cartwright was Evelyn Whitney and was actually born in the Caryville Ferry house. I would hope that she would be here today. Okay, sound level pretty good? All right, good. Greta Sabatka is a ferry operator from Meridian, and she's going to talk about it a little bit today. So I always said that my brothers and I are the last of the ferrymen, but really Greta is one of them too. She ran the ferry at Meridian.
You stay right behind you. Maybe on the front will be all right.
Okay, this where I'm standing is making a problem. Okay, how is it now? Okay. The Caryville Ferry was one of a number of ferries that ran on the Chippewa River and providing transportation from the time the pioneers came through. Okay, we're still there. When the pioneers came to the area, the most formidable barrier to transportation, of course, was the rivers. And so they began to build ferries. My own personal theory about when the first ferry was begun was that it was the day after 2 pioneers tried to take a cow across the Chippewa River in a canoe. So they found out right away you need something stable to cross the rivers. There were ferries at Caryville, Meridian, in the middle that ran to the island, and I think possibly there was one at one time down below Meridian at Tyrone.
There was one at Fairplay Island, they called it Fairplay Ferry, and that was part of our farm. Below about a mile below Meridian.
Okay, I want you to have an envelope. I have a pile of envelopes here. People have urged me to write more about the ferries in the area down around Springbrook and Rock Creek. So if you have memories of the ferry or of anything down in that area, if you live down in there, I want you to get one of these envelopes and correspond with me and help me with this project. I'm in over my head now. When we talk about the ferry generally, we don't come with a planned program at all. We simply depend on you to ask questions, and we answer those questions, and in there we get the stories that come with the ferry. So the floor is open to questions now if you have anything you want to ask.
How long did the Elf family run the ferry?
And we ran the ferry from 1949 until it quit running in 1964. So there were 16 seasons, the last 16 years that it ran. And before that, I'm gradually getting the history of who ran it. County board meetings are not all there anymore, so I couldn't get it all up until 49. But we did it the last 16 years. And I'm gonna ask Greta now to talk about how she came to be a ferry operator. Greta Sabatka.
Well, when,
Oh, that's good.
is that good?
They can hear you back there.
Huh?
That's good, because they can hear you back
They
there.
can hear me. Maybe they want. We moved down to Meridian in February of 1960, and I had 3 little children. And I used to take them down to the ferry, and we'd ride across, back and forth on the ferry. And at the time, Ben Buckles was driving the ferry. He says to me, "Can I speak?" So anyway, Ben Buckles was driving it, and he said to me, "Say, you know, I'd like to have some weekends off. How'd be if you asked your dad if he'd come down and drive it?" And I said, "Well, I'll talk to Dad about it." So I talked to Dad about it, and he said, "Well, I tell you, Greta," he said, "I'll go down there with you, but I'm not driving it, you're driving it." And I said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "I'll show you how to put in the clutch and shift it to go forwards and backwards." So we did. We went down there, and I learned how to drive it. We went back and forth on it, and had to let the, I don't know what you call them, aprons down, and I guess that's about it. When I was driving it, I don't remember much of anything else, what really happened, because it was only on the weekend, you know, that I drove it. So,
Do you have questions for Greta about
Did your
Meridian?
kids go with you every time?
my kids went with me, yeah. Herman was working at the creamery in Durand at the time. So that was an outing for the kids and I.
Was it free to go back and forth, or was it on that cable?
It was on a cable.
That's what I thought.
It was on a cable,
Two cables.
yeah.
Was the river about the same width down there as it is at Caryville?
At that time it was. Right now, if you go to the old Meridian ferry landing, you'll find that there's sandbars right in the middle of the river. There's almost no river there. It went to the other side of that little island. So the landing is still there, still a boat landing, and the foundation to Chris Swenson's little house is still there. But yeah, it was about that width. You can see pictures in the other room back there where the ferry is normally displayed that show the width of the river.
Grab the mic there.
You're supposed to have this.
What did it cost to go on the ferry?
It didn't cost anything.
Ferry was free. Ferry was part of the Dunn County Highway System, and they supported it. And the ferry was basically a little piece of a bridge that went back and forth across the river. That's what it amounted to. So,
And now where the little ferry house used to stand, they put a shelter over it. And the sportsmen have really cleaned up down there, and it's beautiful down there in Meridian.
yeah, so there's still a little bit of history to see there. Also at Caryville, the ferry house is still there. So you can go there, and the boat landing by the bridge at Caryville is the old North Ferry landing. So you can still touch a little bit of that era.
You have to tell the story. When you were in Rock Falls, somebody asked you about if you had to get up in the night. Your hours were a certain time.
Okay, I'll
But a guy
tell.
was on the other side honking his horn.
Okay, I'll tell that story. At Meridian, they only had to run the ferry from 6 in the morning until sunset. And when Chris Swenson ran it, he had a calendar there, and he knew to the minute when sunset was. And if you came after sunset, you brought a certain kind of present, he would get you across the river, no problem.
It was water. It was water.
Water wasn't. But at Caryville, we had to run the ferry from 6 in the morning until midnight. That's an 18-hour day. And even with us boys helping Dad, that was a really long day. So at midnight, we really wanted to go to bed and sleep. And if somebody had to get across to an emergency after midnight, we would do it, because sometimes there were emergencies. One night we were all asleep, and somebody drove up on the north side and started to honk their horn. Honked and honked and honked, and Dad tried to ignore it, but the guy kept on honking, and Dad thought, well, maybe it is a real bad emergency, somebody has to get across. So he went over there and came into the north landing. The guy drove on, and it was summertime, and the window was open, and Dad says to him, he said, what's going on tonight? And when the guy answered him, he could just smell the booze come out. I was just an old drunk. So Dad says to him, in a real irate manner, Dad had a flash temper. He said, mister, he said, this is going to cost you $1. And the guy said, well, you can just take your $1 and you know what you can do with it. Then he put the car in reverse and he backed off, not knowing the ferry had already started. Dad says, Dad told for years, as long as he could talk, he said, that was the most beautiful, high, uniform Puma water I ever saw. Headlights flashed up into it, you know. Then they came down. And, of course, he stopped the ferry, and he heard the door open on the car, and he heard this guy slop up the hill. And so the car was sitting there, and Dad went home. He knew the guy had gotten out of the car and was walking up the hill, walking down the road. So the next morning he called Clarence Walters, the sheriff. Clarence came down and they hunted around. They found him sleeping in a haystack in one of the fields. So Dad said, well, what are you going to do to the guy? Clarence said, actually, now he's sober and there's really nothing illegal about backing off a ferry. But he said, I know the record driver in Menominee who was the highest priced guy in the country. That's how it turned out. Freddie can still tell you the name of the guy too. Huh? Fitzhugh. Yeah, that's the name of the man who backed off the ferry. So,
Did it make the Dunn County news?
I don't know.
What year was that?
Two guys in the car?
Yeah, there was two in the car. One was Fitzhugh, but I don't know, they were going duck hunting.
They were on the right spot.
Yeah. So that was our hours. The time that we ran the ferry during the year was generally March until December. Very, very seldom we ever ran until Christmas, but once in a while we did take cars across at Christmas time. Did you run it too when it was getting ice in the river?
I don't remember that part of it.
No. And when the ice got too bad and the landings got all slicked up, then they had to pull the ferry out. And I know I have one picture of the ferry, it was froze in, the river already froze over. Dad would leave it till the last minute because he didn't get paid after it was pulled out. Question?
I brought the sign right there. My dad was a construction foreman for the county when they built the bridge. And that's the sign, and it tells you the hours on it right there. And
Who's your dad?
It's Manny Stevens was my dad. And I've had that in my basement since 1960. That sign right there, it's from the Caryville Ferry.
Okay, yep, that's the old sign. This ferry operates from 6 a.m. to 12 midnight. And then, and I'm glad to see that.
You can have it.
I keep telling that the only artifacts left of the whole ferry are the slivers of art. I want to talk to you afterwards. I want you to have one of these envelopes.
Will do.
Okay, so, question.
Was running the ferry considered a full-time job?
A full-time job,
Yeah.
18 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And it paid well enough to sustain a family income that way?
Yep, when we moved there in 1949, the first contract was for $260 a month. So that's what we got paid. Every year, about February, the County Ferry Committee would hold a meeting in Menominee and advertise for a ferry operator. And anybody that wanted to run the ferry could come over and appear at that time. When Dad got his first contract, he was a farmer. Dad and Mother had grown up in town. Dad grew up on top of the Dodge Street Hill in Eau Claire. But he always liked the idea of farming. So in 1936, when farmers were going broke left and right, he borrowed $2,000 from the government and bought a few horses and cows and went down to Rock Falls and started farming. And they made that last for 13 years. But in 1949, things were getting so you couldn't make a living on a rental farm anymore. So he came over to Menominee and applied for this job running the ferry. And one of his selling points was about the ferry was he says, I've got 4 boys. My oldest boy is 17 years old, and I've got one 11, and he's going to be ready to help run the ferry. And I've got 2 more 4 years apart. He said, and I can run that ferry for a long time because I got the help to do it. And I'm sure that's what got him the job. He kept the job for 16 years. So more questions?
Did do you have a Model A motor or something on there, reel on the cable, or how'd that work?
Yep, that little engine you see there,
Yeah.
that's a Model A. All there was there was the engine and the hood and radiator, and a car rear end. The one axle had a winch on it, so that winch would turn and put the ferry in the engine in low and go across the river and put it in reverse and go back.
You took up the cable then?
Took up the cable. The little cable, 1/2-inch rope center cable, had one wrap around that drum, and it was anchored on each shore. So as it turned, it just reeled itself across the river.
Can you talk about what it was like during flood stage?
Flood stage, we ran the ferry in high water until cars couldn't get to it anymore. Both the north and south approaches to the ferry, there was a low spot in the roads. When the river got so high, the water came across Highway H in 2 places, and cars could no longer get there. But until they could, we would run it. We would run the ferry when the river was full to the banks. So the cars drove straight on level and drove off the same way. So then we would take off that bottom cable. And if you look at our pictures, you'll see that there was a cable up in the air. And there was a trolley on that. Ropes came down from that trolley to hold the ferry in place. To go across and without the engine, we would turn that wheel. You see there's a captain's wheel on there. We'd turn that, and that would feed rope out of in one end and out the other end of the ferry. Turn the ferry at an angle. When the river hit that ferry at an angle, it pushed it across, just like wind in a sail. And when we came back, turned it the other way, and tacked back. So that's how we did that. Did you ever do that?
I'll tell you what, my dad used to take soybeans to Menominee on his old truck. And the one time, of course, the river was a little low. And that's when Chris Swanson was still there. And Chris says, my gosh, Paul, I don't know if we're going to make her or not. He said, you got lots of mussels today? And Dad says, why? He says, we might end up pushing that part of the way. And they did. They ended up, when they got over so far, there wasn't quite enough water, so they pushed that bugger, but they got across. Yeah, he had almost too many soybeans on.
She's talking about sandbars.
Sandbars.
There always was sandbars moving down the river. And a sandbar is like a glacier. If you look at the sandbar underwater, you see the top layer is moving, just a few grains of sand, and that jumps off the end and some more come. And a sandbar can take 3-4 weeks to get through. And on Sundays, the river was really low, because that's when the northern states shut off the water up at the dam in Eau Claire. That river would get way down low, and then the sandbar, of course, was right up, sometimes only that far underneath the water. Then we had to quit running. But the first time I ever gave one of these demonstrations, that a lady said she remembered going down there on a Sunday on the 4th of July, got stuck on the sandbar, and was out there all afternoon in the sun, and they couldn't get it off. So I know how she feels, because sometimes we tried to keep running. We get that Model A going as fast as we can. We take only one car, and we hit that sandbar and it would kind of slide up one side and slide down the other side. So we would get across, but then about Monday at noon, then the river would come back up again. Sunday, of course, was our busiest time. 200 or 300 cars would come down there. People wanted to come down and see the ferry, and they'd be lined up way back. We hated to shut down for anything and disappoint all those people. So anyway, we did it. The question back here.
What, was the water depth or approximately?
The water depth there, a normal stage of water, generally there would be one place that would be about 8 feet deep. Because, you know, if there wasn't a sandbar right there. But that was generally at 6 to 8 feet. And we couldn't quite stand up and walk across it. So on Sunday we might have been able to. Well, people, okay, it's a question.
I remember crossing there with my dad, and we couldn't make it to shore. So we had to drive off the end of the, right off into the water and then jump up to get up onto the bank.
That's right. On Sundays when that river was really low, they did not have that landing excavated enough to get up close. We'd get into the shallow gravel, and then the car had to drive down into some water and then hit that bank and come right back up again. And that's when we collected all those little exhaust deflectors. back in those days. Remember the little chrome things you put on in your tailpipe?
Yeah.
They looked fancy. They called exhaust deflectors. And when the car went down, and when it came back up, the tail would drag on that apron, and there it would be. Sometimes they'd come back and get it, but we always kept a collection of them there. Somebody said, I lost my deflector. I said, take your choice. Here's your bunch of Sometimes, oh, there was more questions here.
How much water did that ferry draw?
The ferry drew about a foot. It had a depth of 18 inches. This is built to scale, and I used an 1.5 inch piece of wood there for the stringers. So it's 18 inches plus the 2 planks, the plank on the bottom. So all told about 21 inches. But it would draw about a foot of water. It was heavy. It was a clunk of a ferry. And in high water, when the current would draw it down, I was real careful about what 2 cars I put on. I would not put on 2 big Chryslers or Oldsmobiles. I tried to keep at least 1 light car on it. Sometimes if it was real high water, I would just put on 1 car. So, Art, what do you say about high water?
Well, it was kind of nerving because once you started out, once you committed yourself to go across the river, you were committed. And if there was a tree coming down or whatever, why, you just hoped and prayed that the tree got there before you did, or you got there after the tree, or whatever, you know. It was kind of dangerous.
How much would, like, say 2 cars on there, how much more water would it draft would it take on that?
Another 6 inches.
Oh,
6 inches, yep. I've seen a lot of times, you only had this much freeboard before that came down. So,
My sister here, Marlene, at that time was Marlene Martinson, and I'm Milt Martinson Jr. We lived in the first house along the river on the north side, the farmhouse back along the river.
after you went past Gerard Wolte's up that road?
No, it was right on the riverbank.
Oh, the old Peterson place.
Yeah.
Yeah, the old Peterson place, okay.
Yeah.
Be sure you get one of these envelopes, please.
Yeah, one of the things I remember is a car, I think the car came onto the apron, and then probably pushed the ferry out, but got hung up there, hanging on the edge of the apron, and then dropped off, and of course it's out in the water. Do you remember that?
Were you driving that day?
Seems like I was driving every time that happened. If you weren't careful, it would push it off. When we were running with the current and didn't have the engine on and that cable to hold us into the landing, we had to tie it up with a rope. But that was a lot of work. You know, kids like to get out of work. So sometimes we try to load cars without doing that. And
I don't think so.
then they would push it out. Then we'd have to push it back in. So the same thing would happen when the cars getting off the ferry sometimes. If they drove off too fast, they would accelerate, push the ferry out, kick it out with their wheels. Of course, sometimes, some people thought that was a big joke. I remember people coming down and they drive on real fast, go way out to the end and slam the brakes on. So they play a joke on that, kids. That's a suspicious laugh, isn't it?
That's Brian.
You ever had that happen, Fred, when you had a car falling at the landing?
Yep, I sure did, lots of times. You found out that car backed off, there's 2 or 3 of them backed off, out in the middle.
Art had one.
Mr. L,
Rolled on, yes.
maybe they've got some memories too. They were before you.
Uh, She lived at the ferry house here. Can you come up and talk to us a little bit? Tell us some stories? We have plenty of time, don't we, Roy?
All afternoon.
We're here till supper.
Yeah, we have our cookies and refreshments out. We have to take an intermission if you want. We can stay here all day.
Yeah, not too close and not too far.
Well, my mother's father run that ferry before we moved here, and she had lived down there until she got out of school, and then she went to Minneapolis, where I was born in January of 1920, and in March of 1920 we moved down there, and my dad took over the job of running the ferry from his father-in-law, because he was retiring. And the house was on the other side of the river than where it is now. And being only from birth to 8 years old, I wasn't too concerned about how the ferry ran or anything, or the water. We swam up every summer, you know. And talking about sandbars, I have pictures of someone standing out in the middle of the river. And the interesting part for me was my mother had an ice cream stand, and during the summer, my dad would put it up, my dad, and on Saturday, they'd come to Eau Claire and get ice cream and gum and candy, and people would come to our picnic area every summer, and my brother had the older boys play baseball, and we had the girls. I have 2 sisters, and one's older than me, and she lives in Seattle, and my younger sister lives in Seattle. But I have pictures there. And so I don't know anything about the operating of the ferry, except my dad used those pike poles, and then he did put a motor on, a car motor. And in the winter, when it froze, in the winter, he used to plow roads. Back then, of course, if you can imagine 1920, there weren't as many cars as there are these days. And I guess that's all I have to say. I got your
Thank you, Mrs. Goulet. She has a very interesting scrapbook of pictures from the ferry and that area down here. So before you leave today, be sure to come up and look at those old pictures. The first time I have seen them. So it's a real bits of history here.
Yeah, you did.
I'll go get the ferry out of the river.
To take the ferry out in the winter time, they had 2 long poles, like big popple trees, I suppose they were. And they would shove those 2 poles under the ferry and hook a great big snowplow to it, the big county truck. What do you call that big truck that the county had that pulled the ferry out with, Fred?
Oshkosh.
All-wheel drive.
Oshkosh.
Was it Oshkosh?
Auto car, Jim.
Auto car. Somebody says auto car.
How long were you guys, from during the spring and to the fall, how long was it operating?
Approximately March till the end of November.
So basically once ice got out of the
Yep,
river, you
so
guys.
when the ice went out and the landings cleaned up some with the first time the water would come up after the ice went out, they would clean up the landings and it would go.
Did you plow a road across the river
crossing the ice on in the winter time. One time we did it there, and this is one person who did not go out there. But Freddie did, Fred and Dad did. Dad had an old 34 Ford. Remember the 34 Ford? It had 4 suicide doors. But we had a real cold spell, and it was froze all the way across, and Dad and Fred got it in their head. They would make a road across the river. And I thought, this is a bad idea. So they went out and they started across, and Dad would shovel the drifts and Fred would drive the car. Well, they came to one little drift, and Freddie says, I think that I could just back up and take a run and go right through that drift. What he didn't know was a piece of ice had frozen up on a slant about this high. He hit that with that 34 Ford, 34 Ford. And I was watching from the house, and that car went that high up in the air. And I thought, when that comes down, there goes Freddie. But it held. It held. And they let that road open for about a week. Then they chickened out too. Because I tell you, I would not go out there on the river.
I've driven across that river there. I saw him.
In the winter time?
Well, I'd drive in the winter time.
Let me know when I get started. Yeah, okay. And you went across and back, and you lived down there at the bottoms?
I lived on this side, my wife taught school on the other side.
Okay.
I made several trips across there.
You didn't get nervous about that?
No, it was nice.
It was pretty cold. Cold snap, 40 below.
Oh.
Yes, you?
I'm looking, my Aunt Ruth from Seattle said that in the winter they had rigged up a box of some sort that they, for the walkers, because people were walking, you know, to town during the winter, and that they could haul people across above the, you know, almost like a ski lift or a tow type situation where they could just, pedestrians could be hauled across.
Carry people across. The cable was up in the air above the water. She says that her sister tells her about having a suspended cage or platform so pedestrians could get across on that, across the river up in the air. Oh, that's the first time I've heard that. I want to get that on record. You don't have a picture of that.
No, we don't have a picture of that. My mother had a good camera too. She took a lot of pictures, but we didn't have the ski lifts.
That's amazing.
It's like they use in ski lifts now.
Well, you can see why they eventually put a bridge in. They just had to do that.
Caryville Ferry ever since?
Well, yeah, the
Did it sink?
big
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Caryville was plumbers.
Went
They sold it.
on a couple times. Freddie was on it one
Otherwise,
time. The
people
county
would
truck
go to Menominee
rolled.
on that side.
The county truck was on there, and it had the lawnmower, the tractor with the mower on to do roadsides. Going across, the truck rolled back. Got way back to the end of the ferry because the brakes weren't set. And Fred told the guy, he said, better hurry and get that truck ahead because it's gonna sink the ferry. It's starting to take water. But the driver got a little nervous and put it in reverse and went front of that. So then it really took on water. Then he got it in the right gear and he went way ahead and all the water that was in the back went to the other end. Then they were in trouble. Then that side went down. Fred got over. You see the lifeboat on the side there? Fred saw what was happening. He was over, he was gonna put the lifeboat down. Well, the ferry was tipped so steeply that the truck began to slide sideways and he was between the truck and the railing. So, having good reflexes, he saved his life and jumped out of there. And the truck slid right over, took the railing and the boat and everything, happened to fall right on a sandbar. So, there they were, and the water was probably about this deep. Freddie says that he saw that truck laying there on its side in the river, and he was stunned, of course, and pretty soon the door opened up, and out these 2 guys popped. So, and then they had to sit there and wait to get rescued. But the ferry would not really sink deep. But I was running it one night after midnight when it sank, and we'd been out roller skating. Rich Donnelly's here today. His 41 Chevy was on there, and his sisters, and some other people were on there, so what had happened was the ferry had sprung a leak in the evening, and Dad went up and went to bed. We had been out roller skating, and we had to go to Eau Claire to take Phyllis back to Eau Claire because she was working there. Dropped her off. Rich had to bring me back, so we go down to the ferry, and I said, well, I take you across, I'll go home, go to bed, and you go home too. But what we didn't realize was the ferry was full of water. And we discovered later that there was a big sliver loose on the bottom of it. So the ferry was full of water. And when we drove on, Rich says to me, he said, that ferry looks awful low. And the first thing I thought of was the question I answered here, that ferry always sits low in the water. I said, it's always like that. So we got out and farther out, and Rich said again, he said, this ferry's way too low, and I put the spotlight on the back, and the back end was already underwater. So Rich put the lifeboat down, and we got in the boat, we went ashore, we all survived. And they eventually pulled the ferry out, and they fixed your car up too, didn't they? And you used that for a long time? You used that car for a long time after that? Yeah? So there was sinkings.
She went underneath. She went out of sight. The lights were on and the car was running when the water hit it.
Yeah, all that was left with the railings were above water.
There wasn't no light out there when we left with the boat.
Hey, you couldn't see anything. Anyway,
The Meridian Ferry, I think.
I saw a picture of the Meridian Ferry one time in a newspaper where it sank. And the Caryville Ferry sank once during the night. The river came up without us knowing it was going to. And when the river came up, the ferry was out too far. The current pulled it under and sank, and we lost it. That was the old ferry, and this was the one they built in '54 then to replace it. So this is what we call the new model ferry. What do you want to say, Art? Okay, Art's going to tell you about. Okay, question.
I'd like to make some comments too. My name is, how's that sound? My name is Wallace Tappan. I was a forester here in the county for a number of years, and we used the ferries very extensively when we were hauling trees in the spring of the year especially. And there you go. Both ferries, okay. Both ferries were in use, but I guess we probably used the ferry at the Meridian a little bit more than we did the other. I was thinking of Albert, the fellow that did all of the maintenance work. I don't remember his last name.
Albert Jackson. Just a little tighter. Okay, I'll hold it for you.
Okay.
It's rattling a little bit.
Anyway, what I was going to say is that the Meridian ferry, well, I should put it another way. In between the two ferries, the county owned parcels of land that were islands out in the Chippewa River. And they could not maintain the roads to it, so they bought the properties from the landowners, and then trees were planted out there. During the time that I was working, we planted, one year that we planted was the last year. And the ferry was disconnected from its cable and both cables. And Albert, this was the man that did the service work, put the apron down and put a outboard motor on it, and we loaded it up with tractors and gasoline and trees and tree planting machines, and ran it upriver to and unloaded on the county island. We called it the county island, and we planted our trees out there, like 50 or 60,000 trees, and then we were all done. We came back again, or the ferry was unhooked again and was brought back, and we were taken back to dry land again. I was only would have a question. You said that the Caryville Ferry was operating in the 1920s, and as I understand it, about 1945 is when the county bought out the people that were living on the islands out there, and they could not maintain the bridges. But was the Meridian Ferry. That was then put in after the bridges were.
I don't know when the Meridian ferry is, but I can tell the story about the ferry that was run to the island and what happened to it. So the ferry that went to the island was originally owned by Springbrook Lutheran Church. And the Lutherans had a church out there on the island. So I suppose the ferry was really to provide access for the minister there. 1943, the county bought that ferry. They had been leasing it for a number of years for $1 a year. So it was really a county ferry by lease. And then in 1943, they bought it and they pushed it up to Caryville, and they used it at Caryville. That was the one that sank in the flood, and we lost it when they built the new ferry.
On the upper end of the upper island, when we were working on it, we found an old ford that had been put in that the earlier peoples apparently had used to drive across from mainland and on through the water and out onto the island. We never found anything on the opposite side because the currents were stronger there, and I think they had a ferry there in those real early years too, at that point.
There were ferries real early. I'm told that the lumber companies probably had the first ferries. They were their own private ferries. That would be back in the 1770s and 80s. So that would be the history of the ferries there. So they ran in a number of places down there, and they were the only way to get across, except the cow and the canoe.
One other incident was a time when Chris Swenson on the Meridian Ferry had put it up for the night. He put the apron down, and somebody in the wee hours of the morning when he was feeling pretty gay came ripping along and out onto the apron and on the ferry and went right on over the end of the line. That was another problem they had.
That would happen. There was always a story about Reverend Ritland, the Lutheran minister who lived in Caryville, who had a church in Rock Creek and Springbrook, and he had to cross the ferry, and he was always in a hurry. He had his 48 Chrysler coupe, and he made that Chrysler move. And he was kind of a little short guy, and so I suppose that his view ahead was not the same as ours. And one day, he was in a really big hurry. He was headed for Springbrook Lutheran Church, and he had no time to spare. And he took off before the ferry got to the landing. And that was a story that always was around about him. Very nice man, but always in a hurry. Art lost a car one time, and then got it back. He can tell you the story.
Didn't have to have a driver's license to operate the ferry, but there were times when I wondered if the ferry operator in particular, one that we mentioned before, was feeling pretty gay too, and he managed all right.
He liked his water.
He liked his water, yeah.
Yeah, one Sunday afternoon, I was running the ferry, and it was a real nice 1955 Chevy come driving on, 55 or 56, whenever the first ones come out with air conditioning, and it was hot, it was humid, sweating, you know, kind of a miserable type day. And the ferry got to the landing, and the car came on, and when they came on, why, they rolled the windows up and turned the air on. And so we were about halfway across the river, and I noticed, you know, something's wrong, you know, and I looked, here the car is going back. You know, it's rolling back, and the ferry's rolling out from underneath it is what's happening. And so I hollered at him, you know, usually you'd say something and that would be the end of it, you know. Well, this guy, he kind of looks the other way, you know, and I waited a little bit, and finally hollered a little louder. He still didn't pay any attention to me. And there was, you know, 3 people in the car. Well, it was getting to the back end of the ferry. I was trying to shut the thing down. We didn't have brakes. And he got right back to the back end of the apron where his tires are about ready to touch the apron here. And there's a worm gear on the other end that when you turn the deal here, why then one apron will go up and one will go down. It's counterbalanced. And so at that time I might have been 140 pounds dripping wet. And I thought, well, that car is, what, a ton or better? And I was gonna grab hold of that wheel, and I was gonna hold on to make sure that he didn't go off, and I just went through my mind, you can't do that. Well, in about 2 seconds, that wheel took off, and boy, I was glad I wasn't nowhere around it. And as the car started going over, you ever see anybody, you know, they tip over in your chair, you know how they try to catch themselves? Well, there was 3 people in that car, and they were leaning forward, trying to get the car to come back up on the ferry. And of course, it didn't work. So then there was a splash, and luckily enough, they landed on the sandbar. And by that time, I'd got the ferry stopped, so I was, you know, about the length of this room from them. And I distinctly remember this guy. He must have had it set in neutral, and he thought he had it in park. I would see him reach up, and he put it in gear, and he tried to catch up to me. Well, that really didn't work too awful good. So then I went over and dumped the lifeboat in and took him to shore. And I believe one of us went over to Norm Bryce's, the neighbors there, and he got his truck, and we looked around, and there was always a spare used cable that was up along the road, so we hooked onto that. We hooked onto the car, and we pulled him back to shore. And when the car was up on the shore, they opened up the doors, and water just come bailing up. And the guy says, well, what am I going to do now? And then my dad said, well, maybe you just start it. So the guy got in, and I could not believe that there was that much water in a tailpipe system. It just kept coming on, kept coming on. And it started, and they just turned around and didn't want to go on the ferry anymore, and they left.
It's tough to lose a customer out there.
I was watching, I seen the whole show, I just got off the ferry. I laid down in the grass and I just rolled, it was so funny. There was 2 old ladies in the back seat, they opened up the door, got out, and put their skirts up above their knees and stood there screaming on the sandbar.
Any more questions?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Did they build the ferry on site, or did they float it down, or?
They built the ferry right there on site. To begin, they built it upside down, put the bottom on it, put stringers upside down. Inside are 2x18 stringers, and 54 feet long. So they put them upside down, put the bottom on. The bottom is all tongue and groove 2x12 planks, 16 feet long. In the tongue and groove, they put some oakum in there. You know what oakum is? Oakum is a little roll of rope with soaked in tar. They would put that in the groove, and then they would jam that next plank in there real tight, and they'd go on down that way. Then they turned it over and built superstructure on it. So it was built right there in front of the ferry house.
Whatever happened to the ferries after they were discontinued?
In 1964, when the bridge was opened, the Historical Society in Eau Claire wanted to have the ferry to run it on Half Moon Lake in Carson Park. So the county gave them the ferry, they took it up and it sat by Menominee Street where the Dairy Queen is now. How many of you saw that sit there all those years? All that history sitting there all those years. And so about 1978 or so, 12 years later, they decided they were not going to be able to run that ferry on Half Moon Lake. So they sold it to a junk dealer who dismantled it for the parks, and it's gone. So that's what happened to the ferry. I don't know what happened. Do you ever know what happened to Meridian Ferry?
No. That was torn apart too, because, wasn't it Reinholmes that got the motor off of that?
Oh, I think you're right.
They ended up with the Model A motor off that.
Jackson boys, Albert and George and Meridian were the mechanics that kept us going. And Freddie says they always had 2 or 3 of those Model A engines sitting around. If one quit, they would just slip another one in and go back to work. So and that made that handy. Another question?
How did you get the lights to work?
The lights,
Did you have generators on there? or-
just a generator on the engine, it was just, those headlights you see on there,
Yeah.
they're just old headlights off of the old cars, right out of the junkyard. Remember how the cars had the great big fender and a headlight mounted in between, a freestanding headlight kind of? They just put one on each end and a spotlight in the middle. You can see the spotlight there, and that ran off the 6 volt battery on the Model A engine. So that's how that worked.
But did they use the engine to start the, or I mean, the battery to start the
Sure.
engine?
Oh yeah, always had it, yeah. If we had to crank it, we could crank it if we had to, but one of the things I made on this ferry that is not like the original when I ran. When we ran the ferry, that engine was right up close to that post, so to crank it, you could only get a half a turn. And always had to be pushing down on the crank, which was kind of dangerous. And I never liked that, and now I built this model, I said, I'm gonna give them room. So that's not exactly the way it was, but I like the looks of it. That's the way I wanted that ferry to be. Dick?
What was the reason that they replaced the ferry for the bridges? The true reason?
The reason they put in a bridge to replace the ferry was simply it was easier to get across. What was the other one, do you think?
The number of people they counted crossing that to go ahead and show that they really had a reason to put that new bridge in there.
Public pressure. The state of Wisconsin has to give permission for counties to build bridges. And in 1778, they gave Dunn County permission to build a bridge across that river. But it took until 1964. So you can figure out the numbers, over 80 years or so, before they finally got around to building. All the years that we lived there, they said, well, maybe next year they're gonna build a bridge, maybe next year they're gonna build a bridge. And so they never did. One of the other things is when we lived there, Dad had this contract that was only good for 1 year. So every year they would say, well, do you think we'll get the contract next year? And Mother said, I would sure like to have some chickens. Well, Dad said, we buy chickens and build a little chicken house and all that. We might not be here next year. Same thing, we're gonna plant some apple trees. Well, we might not be here next year. So and the same with the bridge. We might not be here next year. Finally they did get the money appropriated and built the bridge. It was built by L.G. Arnold, and the girders were designed by, was it Phillips? No, not Phillips. Who's the, huh?
Phoenix.
Phoenix built the girders, and that was a new design at that time. That was the first one Phoenix had built of that design, and they put it there at Caryville. So that's a little tiny bit of history too. Yes, sir.
Did the county own the ferry house?
County owned the ferry house. The ferry house came with the job. One thing that did not come with the job was the gasoline to run the ferry. Part of the contract was that we had to buy our own gasoline. They did not trust us with a 50-gallon barrel of county gasoline. Okay, we're going to change film back here for a second. We going again, Phyllis? Are we running? Yes, sir.
I don't think anything has been mentioned about the fact that it was quite a tourist attraction too, is that people come from miles around on a Sunday afternoon just to cross the ferry.
And during the week, it was mostly just the local people. Once in a while, the tourists would come through during the week, during the days. But on Saturday afternoon, traffic began to build up a little bit. And on Sunday afternoon, and especially with a nice Sunday, we really had the traffic. And if some writer had come down from Minneapolis or up from Milwaukee or someplace and wrote a feature story about the ferry, we just braced ourselves because we knew we were going to be there.
Did you keep the house?
Did we keep the house? Yes. Dad and Mother bought the house. When the bridge was being built, Art worked on the bridge for L.G. Arnold, saved his money, and when the ferry went out, the house was put up for sale on bids. That's legally, the county had to do that. They have to sell to the highest bidder. Dad bid $2,500, and I know it was a nice piece of property, but everybody knew Dad was bidding on that. Dad and Mother wanted that house, and so apparently everybody just kept quiet and did not put in a bid to get that house away from them. And they lived there until 1978, I think. And then they moved to the towers in Eau Claire. But the people still live there at that house. That's the old Ferry house. Yeah. What time is it back there? 2 o'clock? Getting tired out? Yes?
What kind of mileage did you get to cross the ferry? How much gas did it take to go
How
across
much
the
gas?
river?
That'd be a tough one to figure out. But I know on a Sunday afternoon, we would use up that tank of gas. And that was about those tanks are about 20 gallons. So I know we'd get that. So that little Model A was fairly economical. So it was not a gas guzzler. And if we really wanted to be stingy, we could have took the cable up and not used the engine at all. But it was just really slow and a lot of hard work there too. So there was another question back here.
Tell about those, where your living room furniture was made.
How our living room furniture was arranged? Now, Melody is Freddie's daughter. So in our living room, we had one chair always turned around backwards. Sometimes if there wasn't much traffic, there was no cars, be an hour, maybe 2 hours between cars. We could go up to the house and sit. But we still had to watch that other landing on the other side. The car came on our side, on the south side, we could hear it roll up, or somebody would knock on the door, but if they came on the other side, there's no way for us to know without watching. So we had one chair in the living room, and if you look at the pictures of our house, there are some that show the house from the landing. That in the middle window, we had that easy chair turned around facing the window. So in the evening, especially when traffic was slow, family would be doing things. They'd be out in the kitchen, they'd be popping corn or doing whatever they want to do. And one person would be sitting in that chair, facing the other way. So, and we never felt alienated because we usually had a book to read or something. Our family was real readers. Everybody in the house, it was just barely above water. And Dad took it pretty slow, and he says, I think there's something haywire here. He went back and lifted up that canvas in the back, and the guy was bolted with scrap iron. He didn't realize he could have got wet. Harold Nourish lived up by Rock Falls. Anybody know Harold? And he used to drive a cement truck up in Eau Claire. Drove for Ready Mix. And Harold came down there with a Ready Mix truck one time. He was on the north side and he wanted to get home at Rock Falls. He didn't want to drive all the way around to Eau Claire. So Dad said, Harold, you can't go on a ferry with a cement truck. Oh, he said, I haven't got any cement in it. So he thought he could. Dad said, no, you can't. Oh, he said, let's try. Can you just try? He got the front wheels on there, pushed it right into the water. He drove it back off and then bobbed back up again. He had to do that to prove to himself he could not drive a Ready Mix truck on that. What do you want to say, Greta? Any more? Did you bring up some memories here?
But like, we've been living down in Meridian now ever since 1960. And I don't know, Brian would remember Otis Dowell's store. Some of you people probably remember Otis Dowell's store. And Dad said that they used to go for rides on Sunday afternoon and go down to the store and get an ice cream cone. Then they go across the ferry, they come back, get another ice cream cone. I guess Otis was really good with giving ice cream cones.
In Caryville, we had Montage stores, so people would do that too. Another frequent customer of ours, we call them customers, were the people who raised pickles on the other side of the river. Do you remember the pickle factory in Caryville? Sure, some of you probably took some there. But we knew who they were, and people would come across, a whole load of kids, because mostly people who had a lot of children raised cucumbers for the pickle factory. So they would go over there, and then they'd go over to Montage store, or spend a few of those pennies that they got for pickles to buy ice cream. Yeah.
I'm Brian Gabriel, and we moved to the farm about a mile south or west of Meridian in 1948 or 47. And and our cousins from Eau Claire, the city slickers, would come down to us wild Indian kids that lived down in the boondocks in the bottoms of Meridian. And we, on Sunday afternoon, we'd take them across on the ferry, and boy, were they ever scared. Oh, they just couldn't believe it. Yeah, it was really fun though.
People sometimes were leery about the ferry. I asked my wife, I said, did you ever go across the ferry? They lived down in the town of Seymour. And she said, well, we went down there one time, but it was so rickety, we wouldn't go out there. So anyway, I was home one day, and Dad was out in front, and the car came down the road, stopped in front of the house, and they wanted to go across there. They just wanted to do it to see the ferry. And but they had a lady in the back seat who did not want to go across that ferry. She was scared of it. I went outside and listened to Dad talking to him, and he told her about the ferry, you know, how thousands and thousands of times they crossed the river and nothing happens. And he finally got her convinced that she would ride across the ferry with him. So then I was standing right there, and I was a tall kid, I was a little taller than I am now, and I was big around as a whole handle, you know, I was a tall, skinny kid in a t-shirt. And Dad turned to me and he said, okay, Jimmy, he says, take him across. And that lady looked at me and she said, I'm not going out there with that skinny little thing. And that was the end of that trip. Nobody went across. Some of the other people we have here are Donnellys. The Donnellys lived down almost to the Meridian Ferry on the north side of the river. If you went to the Meridian Ferry, you went down through a coulee. At the bottom of the coulee, before you went out into the woods, was the Donnelly farm. And they had two boys, Rich and Lloyd, and a whole house full of pretty girls. So where do you suppose Freddie and Art got their wives? Down at the Donnelly house. And are they ever good wives? What are you going to say now? Careful. Be careful.
They're Irishmen, but my wife take a medication for it.
Freddie could have a little Irish in him, he's half English, so you never know. Well, we've been over an hour. What do you think? You want to go on some more? Or how about you folks? You tired of hearing about it? Phyllis.
Well, in 1964, when my husband and I heard that the Caryville Ferry was going to close, he said, let's drive over there. So we piled our 7 children in the car and another one on the way. The oldest one was 14. We went to this ferry, and we just for the fun of it, we rode over and back and took a picture, of course, and that was one of the most fun things that we did. Kids remember that.
Phyllis is a neighbor, my next door neighbor across the street, and she was a professional photographer. One time I asked her to come over and do this video for me, and that's what she's doing here today. We lived across the street from her for several years. One day she came across the street and she says, you talk about that ferry all the time. She said, here's a picture of it. And if you look at all the pictures that Roy has on a CD here, you'll see the picture that they took that day she's talking about. The old 56 Chevy on there, and Phyllis sticking her head out the window. And that was the very day that she's talking about. How many people here today went across one of the ferries? Well, at least half the people here, actually crossed on the ferry. So don't forget that I have these envelopes up here. If you have any memories at all, I want you to correspond with me, and we'll get this history written down. Because I think it's important, don't you? Don't you think history is important? Aren't you glad that Roy and Frank and the other guys had us over today?
We go to Texas every winter, and on the Rio Grande River at Los Ebanos, they have a ferry down there that holds 3 cars, and this ferry is 4 Mexicans pulling across on a rope. They don't have any motor on it at all, and it's the only ferry in the United States that's on a border of the United States, and it's the only ferry still going. It's a government ferry, and it goes from the United States into Mexico and back. And you cross it 3 cars at a time.
Can you give me a picture of that?
I have a picture of it.
Well, I would sure like to have one.
Okay.
How many of you gone across the ferry somewhere else in the United States, on a little river ferry? Yeah. Merrimack is still running down there, Merrimack's the only one. Texas, there's a ferry still down, that runs between Wisconsin and Iowa. What's the name of that little town down there? Between Wisconsin and Iowa, a little ferry that's still running across the Mississippi. And I went down there one time to go across it, and it was a weekend, and it was not the tourist season yet or something. They weren't running during the week or whatever it was, so I didn't get to cross it. Anybody have any more ferry stories?
What are you gonna do with the memories if you get in those envelopes? Are you gonna write a book?
I want to write a book. So I'm in over my head.
Yeah.
I'm really over my head, so I really need your help. Because there's not enough just about the ferry to write about. We got to write about the stores around there, the people. I still know some of the Norwegians that live down there in the bottoms. And a lot of those are descendants of people who came from Soknedal in Norway. So I just talked to Gladys Holte Telford yesterday about that. She's going to help me. She's got books. So let's all get together.
What about the ghost? What about the ghost?
Ghost? Yeah. Ghost?
That's what there's something on the internet right now about down in Caryville, on the other side of the river from Caryville. That supposedly there was ghosts in I don't know, schoolhouse or.
I saw that on the internet. Yeah.
Springbrook Schoolhouse has ghosts in it?
Yeah.
With a church right across the street? Can't them Lutherans do something about that? I want to hear more about that. If anybody knows about that ghost at Springbrook, I know where there's some ghosts over by Mondovi. Still living in a house that people built a new house and they're still there. Can't get rid of them. So, this was not on the agenda, was it? But we want to get this history now. Roy's going to come up now and end the program. I want to tell you how happy the Elf Boys, Greta and Hilma are to come over and tell our stories and get this into your memories. You can tell your children, your grandchildren, and if you'll help me, I'll write some more about it. I have written, some of you have seen it in the country today.
We have a deadline as far as the information.
No, the books don't get written overnight. So.
Was this in Eau Claire Leader or in the Dunn County News?
There was something in the Dunn County News today?
Not in Eau Claire Leader. Not in
The Eau Claire Leader missed it. The Eau Claire Leader reporter was here, Roy said, and I talked to her. She called me on the phone and got information, and we're going to tell the story about the time the cable broke and slapped Art right in the butt. I didn't know about this sign, so I always said that the only thing left of that ferry is those slivers that Art's carrying around.
You talk about that cable breaking, and maybe that was the time that we were coming down there to go across the ferry. Dad just come down there, and they're coming over to pick us up, and the bottom cable broke. And they did get it over there, but then they asked Dad when they drive on kind of fast to get the brakes, to send them off, get them started across. Then they had to pull it across to get to the other side.
Yeah, that's, if we got it kind of tight into the landing and couldn't get it loose, we would actually have a car back up to the back, go up to the front and hit your brakes. And of course that would jar loose from the bank. But we had to pick our driver because make sure they would stop.
Okay, we got time for one more.
We're not on a schedule here.
One more story?
Sure.
Okay, Art's got a story.
We like stories.
It was in the fall, and school had started, And I come home from school and I noticed my dad, he had some 5-gallon pails with corn cobs, you know, ear corn in them. I couldn't figure out, you know, and as the week went along, they kept showing up more and more, you know. So I kind of figured out that somehow or another I was going to get worked into something. So one night I come home and he says, Art, he says, come here. So he took me up by the house and he says, now, he says, I've got these sacks of corn and these 5-gallon pails now. He says, every night when you get home from school, I want you to shuck out kernel corn, fill a pail about a third full, and then fill it half full of water. And then you do that for like 3 nights, and then you take the first one and you pour the water off, and of course the corn is real soft and puffed up, you know. And then you go down to the North Ferry or the East Ferry landing, the bay, and you throw that corn out into the bay. And he said, well, see if we can't get some fish to come in. So that went on for about a week or 2, and you know, I didn't even have to throw the corn out in the river. All I had to do was walk on the shore, and you could see streaks coming from the middle of the river. And they would come in there, and when I throw that corn out, it would be just almost like a pig pen. And so the Brightons from Pepin would come up, and they were commercial fishermen. And so they came up one Saturday morning, and my dad says, now, he says, when you guys go, he says, make sure you get back here about 4 o'clock. He says, Art has something for you. So they took their commercial fishing with a big net and everything. They went down the river and they come back up. And Burley says, well, now Billy says, what is this that Art has? And he says, you just come over here, you take your end of your net, he says, and you stake it here by the upside of the ferry with your net on your boat and get ready to go. And so they put a big stake in the ground and tied one end of the net on the ground there. And at the time that I normally fed them, I walked down with my corn, threw it out, and the fish, you know, you could just see them coming. And so then my dad gave Burley the sign on the boat, and he took off, and they went upriver with the net, and it unfolded as they went up. And they had 300 foot of seine, and they went around that bay and brought it in, and then they'd bring the top end back down the current, pulling it in along the shore. And if I remember right, it was just a little under or a little bit over a ton of carp that they got out of that upper bay. So that's just a little bit of history that, you know, that might.
Maybe they could do that with sheephead now, get rid of them.
Well, that might be.
They're no good for nothing.
Very good. So thank you all for coming. Oh, yes, I gotta remind you about our first grade rendezvous.
Just not one to sit around.
Wasn't that in the 70s?
Sometimes that stuff is more fulfilling.
What did you tell them? You never think about it.
Still, some of the stuff.
Yeah. His wife is still living in Meridian.
You got one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stage 4 one. He could about 6 months there, and then he kept going back to Of course, if they had more ones, they got just a few years. Then a couple years. Yeah, just the last couple years. I know exactly what kind you had, what to do for it. Yeah. 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 That's a rough way to go. No, it leaves. It doesn't.
Yeah, tear myself loose.
I'll tell you the phone, see if I can get some more.
Phyllis? Phyllis?
You know Nancy, no? No. She was the gal that was responsible.
They're kind of in all together, you know. There's some here. And so look through it because there are some.
Oh, this is yours.
No,
That's him, and this is his brother from, he came from Oslo after we moved down to.
My husband is tied up, so I'm just sitting eating cookies.
And these are his three sisters. And Helga was my, they all ended up in
He's in the paper all the time and everything out here.
That's Samson, that's Chris.
Yep, yep, that's the one right there. I gotta see if this other picture's over here.
Okay, that's true.